viewers, my name is Robert Farley, and I am an assistant professor at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. With me today is Commander Chris van Avery of the United States Navy. Chris is a military professor at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, and he is in, if I am correct, you are in Waikiki, Hawaii. Is that correct?
I am in Waikiki. We're on Fort Tarusi, right next to the Halikoa in what used to be the Hawaii National Guard headquarters, but the center took it over, I guess, about a decade ago.
Right. I mean, is it as gorgeous as it sounds?
Yes, it's very nice, except for the traffic trying to get to and from work every day. It's almost as bad as Boston.
Oh dear. Well, that's pretty bad. So, could you tell us a little bit about? Because I'm pretty sure that probably not a ton of our viewers have heard of the center. So, could you tell us a little bit about the center and what it does?
Sure.
And other similar centers?
Yeah, the Asia Pacific Center is one of 5 regional centers for security studies that fall under the control of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. There's one center for each of the geographic combatant commanders. So the Asia Pacific Center is affiliated with PACOM. There's the Near East and South Asia Center is affiliated with CENTCOM. Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies is SOUTHCOM. The Africa Center is Africa, and of course the Marshall Center is associated with Germany. UCOM. I would say the other 3, other than the Marshall Center and APCSS, they're all in Washington. So if you want to get to a center, pick UCOM Center or pick PACOMs because it's a better road trip.
Right.
And basically,
go ahead.
Centers are trying to do 4 things. The first one is building communities of interest among security practitioners, basically networks of people who are working on comprehensive security problems, not just national defense, but also economic security, health security, food and resource security, energy security, fill in the blank. So we're not narrowly focused on the national security or the national defense, the military piece of it. We do a little of that, but very, very little. Second thing is strengthening institutional capacities, whether they're national institutions or international institutions, their ability to basically build understanding and address security problems that they have either within their own country or they share in a border area or an interface area in the global commons. Third is fostering whole of government approaches. Comprehensive security obviously complements that. You can't necessarily deal with all of your problems with just one branch of the government. So we've got people from not just ministries of national defense and militaries, but about 60% of our fellows come from other organizations, either within governments. Think the ministries of foreign affairs, the economic ministries, trade, public health ministries, interior, and so forth, law enforcement agencies, and then also international and non-governmental organizations, people that do relief and aid and things like that. And then last but not least, through the research program, we try to build and promote critical thinking about kind of the comprehensive and the comprehensive nature of security and the interconnectedness of all these things. So, for instance, we've got a visiting professor program that just started up, and we'll have a faculty member from institution in the region coming to visit the center for, I think it's basically a year, to work with us on some projects and programs and interface with the fellows. So, 2 things we're not. We're not a war college. We don't do the war fighting piece of it, the operational arts stuff. And we're not a talk shop. We try to avoid things that don't have tangible results or produce at least reasonable to-do lists and plans that can be acted upon. If you're looking for something to just come and state your opinions and get on the record, we generally don't do much of that.
Right. And so it serves as an area in which pretty much everybody in the region can sort of get together and can talk about problems of either common problems or problems of common interest or along those lines, and essentially solutions or at least approaches can be developed, right? And in that sense, it's basically sort of an institution that facilitates cooperation in the region. I mean, would that be a correct characterization, do you think?
Yeah, well, and not only do we facilitate cooperation in the region, but in some circumstances, we've increased nations' capacity to do security cooperation on their own. We've got, there's an alumni network of about 7,000 alumni right now from almost 70, I think maybe even more than 70 countries now. And some of these alumni associations have really changed over the last couple of years from being basically an opportunity to get together and have a beer and reminisce about their time in Honolulu to where they're actually sponsoring events and working with alumni associations in other countries to get practitioners from their own countries together, with or without APCSS being there, to actually dialogue about some things and take a look at what's going on and what the issues are and how they could potentially approach them. So, yeah, that's a key piece to it. And we've got participation, I said, from 70 countries. We've got all of the countries of the PACOM AOR except the DPRK in Burma right now. And I think Burma probably will be back participating in APCSS activities here sometime in the relatively near future, maybe a year or two down the line. And then I think we've got another 30 or 40 countries, or 20 or 30 countries from kind of the periphery. So we've had South American countries come, countries from Africa on the east coast of Africa, countries from the Middle East that have either a stake or they've got an interest in what's going on in the Asia Pacific.
Right, right. Well, I mean, obviously, the countries in South America, or at least the Pacific, but also even Brazil, should certainly have a stake in what's going on in the Pacific. Has there ever been any? I mean, I can understand. Sort of, let me phrase it another way. The exclusion heretofore of Burma and the DPRK, is this a voluntary exclusion on their part, or have they never been invited prior to this, right? Is this something where Burma is going to sort of receive, or certain Burmese persons are going to receive an invitation, or, I mean, how does the mechanism of that work?
I'm not entirely sure about that. I've only been here for 2.5 years, so I don't, and my impression is they have been they've been excluded for quite a long time. In some cases, I think in Burma's case, it may be because of the ban on direct military-to-military interaction.
Right.
There's probably a similar kind of situation with the DPRK. I don't think the DPRK would come, even if they were invited at this point, but you never know.
That would be pretty surprising, actually, if they would send somebody to DPRK. For anyone who isn't up on the acronyms, is North Korea, of course. It would be very surprising to me if they sent someone. Well, so moving on, sort of to a bit to a, I mean, taking this from this conversation about sort of regional collaboration and institutions that facilitate sort of, I guess what we would call this, what we would call this in political science terms is almost like a robust epistemic community, which is sort of a network of practitioners and basically holders of knowledge who work in a particular field. It's a transnational network, and in this case, it's an epistemic community devoted to, what sounds like the production of better governance. Both sort of international and domestic governance. So moving from this idea of facilitation and so forth to a particular issue in the Pacific region, and an issue that has become more relevant over the past few years and perhaps even the past few months. The South China Sea is a region that is claimed by a number of different nations in Southeast Asia, or parts of it are claimed by a number of different nations within Southeast Asia. The most notable of these is the People's Republic of China, which has recently been, over the past year or so, been sort of at least rhetorically assertive in terms of expressing its claims to the region, but also the Philippines, also Vietnam, also the Republic of China, Taiwan, and a few others. And the South China Sea is an interesting area because there are a whole bunch of different legal and security, but also economic issues surrounding the ownership and control, and I guess another way to phrase it would be access to the resources that may be in the area, and there's still some unsettled notion of what exactly those resources are. So, I mean, could you sort of briefly elaborate on that? What's at stake in this dispute, or sort of quasi-dispute, or I don't know, potential dispute over the South China Sea?
Sure. The like you said, at the root of the problem is overlapping claims. The law of the sea and then customary law before that had kind of different rule sets on how the water space would be divided up and who had rights to what and who had no rights in various zones. The issue is actually the claim that was originally asserted by the nationalist government that when the Kuomintang back in the 1940s, I think 1947, asserted this right over basically all of the South China Sea, all the way up to what is considered the territorial waters of the other nations that border the region. People's Republic of China reasserted that claim, I think, about 1993 or 1994-ish. There were a number of clashes, particularly through the 70s into the early 90s. Direct military.
These were violent militarized clashes in the 1970s between Vietnam and China, especially.
Absolutely, there was a naval war between Vietnam and China, and it was mostly over the South China Sea. Although part of the dispute between Vietnam and China, and part of the reason for the vitriol is in the northern reaches up in what used to be called the Gulf of Tonkin. There were very violent clashes between fishermen of the two countries and then military clashes. And my understanding is China and Vietnam have settled that particular area, and it's not so much in dispute. The area in dispute now is much farther south, basically in this network of reefs and shoals and a couple little islands down at, kind of on the eastern side, wrapping around to the south, because there is the potential for oil and gas and some other things, some other kind of resources down there. The Chinese latest claim for energy resources is something called crystal gas, which I guess is a hydrocarbon that's somehow trapped in a crystal lattice. And the first time I heard this argument about these crystal gas, I thought manganese nodules, which was the reason why the Reagan administration wouldn't subscribe to UNCLOS, because there were these nodules of this strategic mineral called manganese on the seafloor, and they wanted to be able to exploit them. Well, here we are 30 years later, and nobody's commercially exploited manganese nodules, I don't think, anywhere on the seafloor. But there they are. And then the second piece of that is really fish. With the growing populations, not just in China, but particularly around the southern rim of Southeast Asia, or the South China Sea, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, they all have growing populations. They all have an increased need for food resources, and naturally they look to the ocean for a lot of that. Vietnam is particularly hard-pressed because they get a lot of their fish right now from the Mekong, and there's questions about how the fish stocks in the Mekong are going to be affected by damming farther up the Mekong, going all the way into the Tibetan Plateau and the Chinese. So, in China, Vietnam is really feeling pressed on both sides. They're having their resources basically denied to them by their perception by China, both in the ocean and in the Mekong. So it's very tense and it's very contentious.
So, I mean, to what extent, and I know from some Chinese sources and from conversations I've had with Chinese, to what, or that they perceive this as a situation in which it is emerging, the conflict over the South China Sea is emerging as a China versus everyone else. Is this how other countries envision it as well? I mean, is there sort of a general consensus that, wherever you put the blame, whether you put the blame on Chinese assertiveness, whether you put the blame just on the fact that China is an 800-pound gorilla in the region, or whether you put it as sort of as the Chinese sort of do, as like some sort of grand conspiracy to screw over the Chinese. Is it correct to say that at least among sort of the nations in the region, that you were developing into a situation where it is China versus the rest of them, or are there still sort of important conflicts between Vietnam and the Philippines, and Vietnam and some of the other claimants?
Well, I would say the only notable non-Chinese conflict right now is probably between Vietnam and the Philippines. Vietnam and the Philippines, the relationship is still pretty tense. Still interact with each other in the region in a negative way. Philippines and Indonesia have done a fair job of resolving a lot of their territorial disputes, and there's really not a whole lot of overlap. The issue that kind of brings China to the forefront and makes them the big player is, number one, the perception in the region that China wants to be a hegemon, and they want to be able to assert control over things. China's claim is not actually identical to the others in its substance either. I mean, aside from the territorial issue, China doesn't assert that they just have rights to all the natural resources in this region. They assert that it's their sovereign territory and it's basically an extension of land, so they should be able to dictate any kind of activity that goes and control or prohibit any kind of activity that goes on. The claims of the other claimants typically are only the exclusive economic kind of claims. They don't assert territorial sovereignty, except over some of the things that either are islands or they've created to make it look like an island and sort of fit the definition of an island under other laws.
Right.
But yeah, there's very much a perception within the region that not only are the Chinese basically trying to use their newfound influence and power to basically bully the region, but there's also a perception that China is trying to pursue a divide and conquer kind of strategy, whether they are or not, because China has traditionally resisted and still steadfastly resists any kind of multilateral approach to all of this. As I said before, they achieved a bilateral solution in one limited area with Vietnam, but they're very resistant to having outside powers intervene like the United States and Japan. They're very resistant to dealing with this through ASEAN, although ASEAN is becoming more and more interested and more willing to discuss it. So, yeah, China is viewed as, throughout the region as kind of the primary problem. And then there are ancillary issues, particularly between both the Philippines and Vietnam that have resulted in clashes and conflicts.
So, how would we? I mean, I can imagine three different ways of sort of describing why the United States considers itself, and the United States Navy particularly, but sort of more broadly, the United States considers itself to have I don't want to dog in this fight isn't quite the right, but an interest in the area. Sort of the first way I would go about describing it is that this is an area of potential disorder, right? And to the extent that the different parties push, regardless of who may be in the right and regardless of who may win, it's bad for everyone. It's bad for maritime commerce. It's bad for the economies of the region. It's bad for everyone if there are bad relations in the area, and so therefore the United States, ought to step up and ought to play a role in facilitating the development of some kind of solution. The second way I could imagine someone arguing that the United States has an interest in this region is, specifically in response to sort of the most expansive of the Chinese claims, right? The notion that this is the sovereign territory of China, which then has a bunch of implications for freedom of transit through the area, but it also has sort of broader worldwide implications because if the Chinese make this sort of claim, then other countries might make this sort of claim, and freedom of the seas, which has traditionally been an absolutely critical value of the United States and something that we've been willing to go to war with in the past. Freedom of the seas is threatened. The third is that the United States sees an opportunity to build a coalition against what it perceives to be a rising regional power. And again, I think the Chinese, really, as far as I understand, seem to adopt interpretation number 3, but all 3 interpretations seem to me to be plausible. I mean, do we have to choose between those, or am I completely out of left field and this is a completely wrong-headed way of thinking about why the United States has interests in the region, or is it some combination of those 3? I mean, what are your thoughts?
I think it would be wrong to try and choose between those. I would dispute. I don't know about dispute, but taking the third point first, there is very much a perception within China, and the academic literature is rife with this, that their perception is the United States is basically using all of the nations of the South China Sea and Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia, where possible, as proxies against China to try and contain China. Now, there's probably a faction within the United States government, policymakers, that do want to do that, because not everybody loves China. They're not all panda huggers, but there are panda huggers and there are panda haters. Mm-hmm. So there are some that certainly want to do that. There are some that want.
That's a really bad. The panda haters are always going to lose on that. The panda haters need to come up with a better something better than panda haters, right? I don't know, maybe MSG haters or something. I have no idea what they have. They have to come up with better than panda haters, because nobody likes a panda hater.
Yeah, I know. Anyway. It is a tough thing to say, but that is the Chinese, at least in the official literature. Generally, that is the preponderance of the kind of opinion. Now, there are opinions that appear more frequently that don't necessarily support that in the Chinese. But I think it's a mistake to assume that in this particular cafeteria of why is the United States there, that you only can pick one dish. It's a buffet, it's a cafeteria, and I think all three things that you talked about really are going on. U.S.'s 3 stated interests that get repeated anytime somebody makes an official statement is, number one, the United States wants the situation to be resolved peacefully and without violence, and it should be solved through the international system and the international legal system that has been adopted. Now, the U.S. has a little bit of an Achilles heel on that one, because while the UNCLOS treaty has not been adopted by the United States, it's currently being debated. We do generally kind of comply with the terms of it. Basically, the position is we haven't officially ratified it, but we abide by it anyway. And the irony of that is China accuses us of not basically having a say in that because we haven't ratified it, but they have ratified it, but they don't abide by it. So
right.
There's a little bit of hypocrisy, perhaps on both sides, or kind of a little bit of swampy position that people are trying to take based on what's going on. The second piece of it is the freedom of navigation piece. The ships' free flow of trade through the area should not be hindered. The free flow of warships through the area should not be hindered. It should be treated like basically the high seas, international waters, or EEZ, depending on where it is. Restrictions on transit and activity should be governed by international convention, and not by this kind of special rule set that China appears to be trying to assert. And then the last piece is arguably a selfish piece from the United States. The United States wants to be able to have that area, because it's of strategic importance, considered to be international waters or EEZ, depending on what parts of it, so that we can have access in the event we need to move forces into the area and do things, whether it's disaster relief or it's averting a conflict or potentially deterring an aggressor against a treaty ally in the form of the Philippines.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, I guess just briefly before we get on, because I want to talk about. I mean, we've talked about this mostly so far in terms of a sort of a sort of high diplomacy argument, but I want to draw it back to the actual Navy in a second. But besides the United States, to what extent have the other big players in the region and sort of just outside the region, I'm thinking primarily here of India and Japan, but perhaps even of South Korea, which of course has a large and growing navy. To what extent have these other players, which are not Southeast Asian countries and which don't have specific claims, to what extent have they taken an interest in what's going on here? And I mean, have they largely mirrored the United States, or are they operating under their own logics, or what's interesting coming out of New Delhi and Tokyo right now on this issue, if anything?
Well, Tokyo has been, Japanese in general have been, I guess, taking a more high profile or higher profile, and more willing to get involved, particularly through ASEAN, and doing some things to basically shore up the position. I don't really get into the specifics on that. I don't know. India is developing some cooperation opportunities with Vietnam in particular for energy exploration, possibly exploitation. That has kind of raised the hackles of Beijing and resulted in one peaceful confrontation, if there is such a thing, when an Indian warship was departing a port visit from Vietnam. It got challenged as soon as it was out of Vietnam's territorial waters. It was 19 or 20 miles out. The Chinese ship that confronted it, which is not a warship, but basically challenged India's right to even be present in the waters. So India has been moving into the region both for economic purposes, but also I think for counterbalancing for what they see as a Chinese move into the Indian Ocean, their development of their string of pearls. So they've decided to kind of expand beyond what is they consider their kind of traditional area of influence into the South China Sea to basically, I guess, roll the boundary back into China's backyard.
Right. I mean, this is interesting. This is interesting, of course, and you suggested this in an earlier version of this that that China has made this move into the Indian Ocean. Of course, the Chinese are fighting pirates off of Somalia because everybody likes fighting pirates, but also to gain sort of experience with distant operations and so forth. But that India, which is a country which has a substantial navy of its own, rightly views. And the Chinese have also pursued the establishment of naval bases in the Indian Ocean too. Is that?
Well, it depends on what you mean by naval bases. My understanding is all they've got right now is basically access. Something, kind of along the lines of what the United States has in Singapore. I don't think they've announced. China, I don't think has announced any plans to try and forward deploy ships to these. They basically have this string of what used to be called coaling stations, places where they can go and they can have access to maintenance facilities and fueling facilities and so forth, and operate out of. They basically run from Burma down through Sri Lanka and the Maldives, because it's not hard for the Chinese, who have had, I think, 2 major border wars with India in the last half century or so. It's not hard for the Chinese to see how the Chinese get worried when they look at India basically pointed like a dagger at the heart of their sea lanes, connecting them with their primary source of oil, which is the Middle East.
Right, and during those, especially the 1962 war, China was much less dependent than it is today on sea transit of all sorts. Right, extremely dependent on energy, but it's also extremely dependent just on sort of normal maritime commerce.
Exactly.
For transit through the Straits of Malacca and so forth. So, of course, messing with Chinese trade in the Indian Ocean would be a significant escalation of just fighting over some glaciers. But nonetheless, the Chinese have to take seriously the potential that the Indians might do something like that in the case of a serious conflict.
Well, I don't know. Fighting over glaciers might be a relatively minor kind of interference when you consider that messing with Chinese shipping lanes is basically interfering with their economic and their growth and development goals for potentially a long time if it's a problem that persists.
Right, and when you mess with some tanker carrying oil to China, you're not just messing with China, right? Because most of the tankers that carry oil and other things to China probably don't carry Chinese flags, right? And so you're potentially messing with sort of the global shipping industry at the same time. So, but still, the Chinese are concerned, and the Chinese and Indians are concerned about each other, and so you can read Indian interests as being strategic here. So. Back to the point I was hinting at before. This that we've talked about so far sounds like a dispute of high diplomacy, right? Something that the State Department is primarily concerned with, something that the legal scholars are primarily concerned with in terms of evaluating claims, something that people who work where you work are concerned with in terms of sort of creating this, these communal networks between these nations that have not a high diplomacy but have a low diplomacy role. But what is the role of the United States Navy in this kind of situation? And I mean, you should feel free to sort of expand. I mean, we're talking obviously about the South China Sea, and so this specific dispute, but we could also sort of talk more broadly about the Navy's role in diplomacy. But, what does, the U.S. Navy do either, sort of in a very material, direct sense, or also just sort of in its basic existence, so potentially even in a deterrent sense? How does the U.S. Navy change this kind of dispute, or how does it help facilitate a resolution to this kind of dispute?
Well, I'm not.
That was a long question.
I'm not sure the Navy's really going to help facilitate a resolution to the dispute. I think to this point, the Navy's role in this kind of dispute has merely been to basically be present, move through the area in the fashion we would any other international body of water, and do the kind of operations in this particular water space that we do in other places. So really, and this I think is kind of a throwback to the old customary law system, because traditionally under the old way the law of the sea worked, precedent mattered more than rules in a lot of respects. So if you avoided an area and you didn't go in an area and you didn't do certain things in an area, you could lose your right going forward to do those things. So the United States Navy uses those waters now to transit from through the Western Pacific into the Indian Ocean. The United States Navy uses those waters to participate in exercises with partners in the region like Singapore and Philippines and Indonesia. And I seriously doubt there's any plans to stop doing that because of that old kind of traditional customary law mindset.
Right. So, I mean, I guess if I were to phrase the question in a slightly different way, there was a report that came out of the Heritage Foundation last year. I think it was called "A Day Without Sea Power," and it was by Mackenzie Evelyn and Brian McGrath. And it essentially posited a scenario in which the United States Navy was substantially drawn down, and it was almost sort of a British withdrawing from the east of Suez scenario. Where the Navy sort of substantially reduces its global commitments. How would this situation look different? I mean, is the answer that the customary law would look different? Or, I mean, how would we think about this situation in the South China Sea and sort of more broadly the question of China's relation with its neighbors, were it not for the fact that there is a United States Navy that is still sort of widely recognized as being substantially more capable than the Chinese fleet, even sort of acknowledging that the Chinese Navy has increased its size and its capabilities quite a bit over the last 2 decades. So, I mean, I guess that's what I was sort of getting at when I said, how does the Navy matter in this? How does the Navy change the calculations of actors in the region?
Well, I can't really comment on the legal. I'm not a judge advocate,
right.
And I know a little bit, basically enough to be able to understand what's going on. How a day without the U.S. Navy, or a year without the U.S. Navy moving through South China Sea would affect the legal status of the waters and the rights of the littoral states. I don't know. In terms of how it would affect the security environment, I think there would be a lot of countries in the region, other than China, that got very nervous very fast. We've got 5 treaty allies in the Asia Pacific: South Korea, Japan, Republic of the Philippines, Australia, Thailand. And then we've got other regional partners that we have significant activities that we do routinely. We've got kind of a legal obligation to try and shape the relationship between Taiwan and mainland, form of the U.S.-Taiwan Relations Act. I think it would severely hamper the United States' ability to fill the obligations that it's undertaken. So I think what would happen if we didn't have a Navy, or we had a Navy that was significantly reduced from where we are now, it would change all of those relationships. And it's there's already significant concern in the region based on the current economic crisis, fiscal crisis, the budget problem in Washington, the air-sea battle. I think we've probably had 3 or 4 visits from various think tanks and people thinking about security in Japan that have come through the center here in the last year, asking the question, basically, what does this mean for us? What does air-sea battle mean? What does that mean about U.S. presence in Japan? What does that mean about the U.S. presence in Korea? What does that mean about the roles we might have to undertake that the United States may be not be able to fulfill that they've traditionally fulfilled under those treaties? So there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think there's a lot of edginess in the region currently about the United States' ability to do that. I mean, there's been a lot of talk recently about the naval buildup across the board going on in the Asia Pacific. There's one analyst that basically said it's the largest spree of maritime military shipbuilding since the interwar period between the First and the Second World War. And now it's fundamentally different because it's not basically being undertaken by 3 or 4 major powers who are clearly set against each other. It is across the board. You've got, of course, China is building, Korea is building, Republic of Korea is building, Japan's building, Indonesia's building, Vietnam is building, Thailand's expanding, Australia's expanding. So I think that's really a symptom that the region has finally said, perhaps after looking at what went on, has gone on in the last 30 years in our relationship with NATO, that, what, the United States probably can't do it all by itself, probably won't be able to do as much as it can today, 5 or 10 years down the line.
Right. Let's stop there, because there are 2 points I want to talk about briefly. The first one is, the point you made about air-sea battle, and I just wanted to, we have 2 audiences here. One part of the audience both knows what air-sea battle is and has an opinion on it, and probably a strong opinion, and the other part of the audience has not the faintest idea of what air-sea battle is, except that it might be a video game. So air-sea battle is a developing operational doctrine that is designed to, I guess how I would phrase this, to preemptively eliminate the friction between U.S. air and naval forces especially in the Pacific theater. So to create greater opportunities for cooperation between the United States Navy, the United States Air Force, and the United States Marines, such that we might be able to do cool and funky things like, and this is how, and you mentioned how the Japanese have been there asking, what's air-sea battle? But, it seems like every other week there's a new admiral who is writing in proceedings or somewhere else, this is what air-sea battle is. So it's obvious there's some confusion in the United States as well. But people talk about this, an F-22 being able to retarget a Tomahawk missile that is launched from a submerged submarine against a target somewhere, right? That it's a capability we don't necessarily have right now, but what air-sea battle is about creating or about easing the friction between services in the U.S., primarily in the U.S. military, so that they can work more synergistically, to use a buzzword, so they can work more synergistically together. Would you disagree with any part of that? Am I characterizing it right, do you think?
Well, I think that's the meat of the matter. I mean,
right.
Operationally, that's clearly what it's intended to do. But there are strategic overtones, particularly when they talk about parts of air-sea battle that talk about spreading out forces and dispersing things more and repositioning from our current basing strategy to a different strategy that basically rings from, Korea and Japan all the way down into Straits of Malacca. That's got strategic overtones and implications. And I personally think it makes sense because our current presence in the Asia Pacific in terms of basing and infrastructure is 60 years old at this point. It was built after the end of the Korean War and the end of the Second World War to try and deter aggression against the U.S. allies in South Korea and Japan, and bottle up the Soviet fleet and prevent them from sortying, and then intercept Russian bombers that were coming out of the Far East. It's a 70-year-old basing strategy for a threat that doesn't exist anymore, and the threat now is different. It's less obvious if you're talking about China in particular. But it's much more broad because we're looking at a lot of situations where U.S. forces are required to act in a region that is the most disaster-prone in the world, number one, right. And number two, the worst prepared to deal with disaster, and with the possible exception of some places in the Caribbean, maybe probably the area where disasters are the most disastrous. It's the most human, in terms of human cost, they're the most costly kind of disasters that happen. So, the United States.
Now, could I pause you for a second there? I mean, do you think that, because I have always understood air-sea battle as primarily the kinetic part of what the United States military does, but could we also envision air-sea battle as having an implication or sort of restructuring and so forth as having an implication for these kinds of relief efforts that would make them easier, more difficult, would make them more coherent or cohesive? Or should we read it as primarily a kinetic matter?
I think air-sea battle was developed as primarily a kinetic, but I think a kinetic plan. But I think it'll have implications for relief and disaster response efforts as well. Anytime you can get a broader basing structure, anytime you can get a better infrastructure of bases through which you can operate, either move supplies through, refuel and maintain aircraft. That is going to be able to be leveraged, and probably that's what it will get used for most, is being able to move supplies and aircraft and logistics assets into the region quickly and smoothly, and basically get the relief there when it's most needed at the beginning of the disaster.
Right. And it helps. Good communications helps no matter what, right? Whether you're having good communications between an Air Force reconnaissance plane and an Navy amphib and a Marine Osprey, or you're having good communications between an F-22 and a SSGN or something like that, a cruise missile submarine, right? So better communications and facilitating better communications helps no matter what sort of operation you're trying to conduct.
Well, I think the communications is probably not the piece that would be leveraged most. Really would be necessary.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think the piece that would be best leveraged and would pay the most dividends in that kind of HADR response would be the infrastructure and the base access. The ability to have landing fields that have.
Could you spell out HADR?
Oh, sorry. Humanitarian aid and disaster relief or direct relief. It's another military acronym for any kind of human security issue or crisis issue that is not, kinetic. It's not a war thing. It's either a pandemic or an earthquake or a tsunami, something like
that. Back then to my second question about, and this has to do with the buildup in the region. A friend of mine who works actually with Randy Forbes, who is sort of a very well-known naval advocate within the Congress, we recently posted something to Facebook, sort of in alarm about proposed defense cuts in Australia. And this led to a sort of an interesting little conversation. Does the fact that the United States now appears to be devoting more interest to this region, and we can debate how much something like a Pacific pivot actually exists or an Asian pivot actually exists. People sort of talked about this, but it's unclear that this is a word that has any sort of meaning. But could we in the future, certainly in the past in the Pacific region, we've seen burden shedding from U.S. allies, right? U.S. allies that have, taken advantage of the fact that the U.S. is apparently committed to their defense and have, then reduced their defense commitment, reduce how much they're spending on defense. And we, of course, know that this happens a lot in Europe as well, where European countries essentially will shirk responsibilities based on the fact that the United States has those capabilities and will presumably use them. Is this, we are seeing a buildup, a naval buildup, and more broadly an arms buildup in the Southeast Asian and the sort of the broader region right now. Is there any prospect that, I guess two ways of thinking about it, is there a prospect that increased U.S. interest in the region could curtail that, especially among U.S. allies who would now say, well, we can just depend on the Americans? And might that even be a good thing, right? Or do we want all of our allies and potential allies to continue building up as quickly as they can?
Since I've gotten from interacting with the fellows in the region is, I think there aren't many people who think that the United States is going to be able to move enough existing resources to the region or build new resources to the point where they can do the kind of sitting back that perhaps some of the European countries have done and the NATO countries have done over the years.
Mm-hmm.
So I really don't, the people I've talked to and interacted with, I don't think that's a threat. In fact, I think they're all operating from the default position that they're going to have to do more going forward. Even if the U.S. can maintain steady state on the size of its military and kind of representation within the Asia Pacific, even a little increase. I think everybody is assuming that not only can they do more, but they should be doing more. This is particularly notable with Japan, and, Singapore, and Australia. All three are definitely looking at taking a more prominent role in cultivating security in the Asia Pacific, and particularly within the sub-regions.
Right. Okay, well, you know, we were sort of briefly going to talk about how, the fact that the Navy has, for the first time since the 1980s, become an actual issue in U.S. politics in the presidential race. But I don't think there's at this point much to say about that other than the fact that the Navy has curiously become an issue in U.S. politics. For the first time since the Reagan administration. But instead, could we close out by changing gears just a touch and talking a bit about the F-35? I mean, as you had mentioned earlier in the conversation we had, was it Admiral Greenert who had a new article? I can't remember, was it?
Yeah, I mentioned, I think it was Admiral Greenert has an article in the current issue of Proceedings about that some are interpreting as him having some doubts about the future of the Navy's East of That program, particularly with the issue of stealth, whether stealth aircraft are really necessary or not.
Right. Now, to be clear to, again, the F-35, it's something where, half of our audience is going to know what it is and have really, really enthusiastic opinions one way or the other on it, and the other half is going to have not the faintest idea. What is it, a ballpoint pen? But the F-35 has three variants. It is a stealth fighter that's being developed for the United States and something like 18 other countries. The F-35A is the Air Force's variant, and that's conventional takeoff and landing. The F-35B is the Marine Corps' variant, and that is a vertical or short takeoff and landing. And those are really interesting because they can take off like Harriers and they can land on America's and other countries' fleets of big deck amphibious warships, sort of, as some people have argued, effectively creating another 8 or 9 light carriers. And the British are also using the F-35B on their aircraft carriers. And the F-35C is a standard, is called a Catobar. Well, no Catobar aircraft, but it's a standard carrier aircraft, an aircraft that is designed to land and take off from standard conventional aircraft carriers. And Greenert the questions he asked were particularly about the F-35C, whether it made sense. I mean, part of it, I guess, can be phrased as, does it make sense to spend this money on this incredibly expensive airplane when we can continue to buy F-18s, which are, maybe not good enough, but working in collusion with potentially a small number of F-35Cs would probably be good enough for whatever we're trying to do. I mean, is that right? Is that what?
I think that's I think that's what he was trying to get at, and I think maybe what he's got in his mind is moving back to air wings on aircraft carriers that are more composite. So perhaps you have a small number, half a dozen or 8 F-35Cs that fill the role of just air superiority, perhaps with limited strike, basically the way the old Tomcats and the intruders used to. We have some multi-mission aircraft. Their utilization would be more specialized based on even though they did have multiple roles.
Right. And so in this sense, the F-35C wouldn't be envisioned as a replacement for the other aircraft, but would be envisioned as playing a new role, and one that some people have argued the F-18 is not well suited for. And again, for people who are not super familiar with sort of the logic of naval aircraft, you want to have as few different kinds of aircraft on an aircraft carrier as possible, because for every new kind of aircraft you have that many more spares you have to carry. You have that many more different types of not necessarily ordnance, but all sorts of tools and so forth. Your maintenance crews have to be trained in a variety of different procedures and so forth, and so it's just much easier. And what the Navy has been doing is making the F-18 do everything, over the past 20 years or so. But sort of what this means in a political sense, if we were to take seriously the idea that the Navy is going to cut its F-35C by, is that the F-35C is going to appear in public to be radically more expensive. Because, and again, this is, sort of a weird part of military military procurement. When you cut the total number of purchases, it looks like the total cost of each individual piece of equipment goes up because all of the innovation and production costs are then sort of folded into the bulk. So
yeah, well, and that's not actually unique to military. That's true of any economy of scale. The more you build, generally, the cheaper cost per unit.
Right, exactly. But I've heard some people argue that this is the beginning of the F-35 death spiral, right? That as it appears to be more and more expensive, it becomes harder to continue the project through Congress, right? And I mean, some people have argued that it is unlikely that the Navy is going to get any F-35Cs. And I think some people have interpreted Greenert's very measured remarks here on the F-35C as opening a wedge, which could mean that the Navy simply rejects down the road rejects the F-35C and stays with the F-18 and looks for something in the future.
Yeah, that may be the case. The Navy may decide that this system is a bridge too far and it's not really necessary for what we do. It gets cut or the buy gets limited and cost starts to look crazy. But I reflect back on the long and storied history of the Osprey. It was a lot of the same discussion going on. Why are we spending all this money on this aircraft? This thing that falls out of the sky. Of course, they don't really fall out of the sky unless you shoot at them now. They've turned out to be a very reliable platform and they're very useful. And there's lots of other people that are interested in buying them and building up a fleet as a result. So.
Right. And I mean, when you talk with people who know, and I guess part of the problem with the F-35, it is difficult to explain what it does to people who are not deeply steeped in advanced, hyper-modern air superiority fighter tactics. I mean, the F-22 is a little bit less difficult to explain because you can just say it's awesome in every way, which it kind of is. But the F-35...
Except in its oxygen generation.
What's that? Well, except for the oxygen generation. Yeah, I mean, it's super awesome except for the pilot's suffocating thing, which is, I guess, an Achilles heel. But the F-35 is harder to explain. It's not a pretty plane. It's kind of an ugly, stubby little plane. And in its, in some of its characteristics, it's sort of deficient compared with fourth generation fighters. But I guess it's interesting. It's interesting to see where it'll go, and whether this statement of, either retrenchment or skepticism has any sort of broader effect on what the Navy does with the F-35C. I don't know what I would bet right now on whether production F-35Cs will ever fly from American carriers. I mean, at this point, 2 weeks ago I would have said almost certainly now. I'm a little bit more skeptical about that.
Yeah,
and whether that's a good or a bad thing depends on your perspective.
I don't know, honestly. It's the one question I do know with the F-35 program in general. I think the odds of the B variant going away is pretty darn small because the Harriers are in so bad shape that we basically bought the entire fleet of Harriers that the British retired as essentially parts cars to try and keep the current fleet running. So what the Marine Corps would do for close air support without the B variant, I don't know. And with respect to the C variant, it becomes a question of what can you do with the Hornets and the Super Hornets? How long can you tease this model out and keep them flying and keep producing them? So those are all questions that are going to have to be answered. I think it would be a lot easier program to kill if there were multiple competitors and possibilities, even an alternate competitor to put in that spot. But really, we don't have it right now.
Right.
And what it would cost to develop that competitor independently without the supporting F-35A and B programs and commonalities, and the 17 other countries that want them, because we're the only ones that operate this kind of craft.
Right.
somebody's going to have to do a cost-benefit analysis to find out if maybe we should just go through with it, get them done, and try to learn something from this particular procurement cycle and apply that to the future.
Right. Well, I mean, I think there's also a legitimate concern, and there should be a legitimate concern, especially in industry, that the F-35 is simply going to be the last major manned fighter aircraft project. Simply because the lead time starting over right now, it just takes so long to actually get a fighter into production. And 20 years from now, it may be the reality that we simply we're willing to spend $200 million on a manned fighter. Just because of a variety of technological and political changes in other parts of the world.
I don't know. Possible.
Anyway, I mean, I think. Go ahead.
It's possible. I don't know about the air-to-air rule and what capabilities come out of that. It's doing the UAV thing in an air-to-air over the ocean. Perhaps possible. I think a lot of the luster is kind of wearing off a little bit in some circles on the UAVs in general, because particularly the way they've been used, there's been some kind of political downside that's developed on the so-called drone war.
Right.
Right. I think I remember hearing 10 years ago or 15 years ago, Navy Admiral aviator saying, 20 years we want to have all the aviators out of the battle space, but I don't know if that's going to work. Politically, in the long term, the idea that you've got somebody sitting in a lazy boy outside of Las Vegas flying an aircraft doing this stuff.
Right, no,
I don't think that's sorted out
as
yet.
if, and it's, go ahead. I was going to say, it's become almost, and this would have been ridiculous 10 years ago, but it's become almost as if it is more controversial to use a drone than it is to use a manned aircraft, right? Even for, completely non-controversial missions that manned aircraft have done for a very long time, simply because of the sort of the political aura that has become associated with drones. And so that might also be an obstacle. So. Anyway, I think this has been a fantastic conversation, and I think we should do it again sometime.
Yeah, well, thank you for inviting me, and I'd be happy to do it again in the future.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for being on the program. Foreign Entanglements viewers, those of you who've made it this far, remember we have a Facebook page. Like that Facebook page. Continue to support. I don't know how anybody supports Foreign Entanglements. Anyway, thank you for watching. And Chris, thanks for being on.
Thanks again, Rob.